Hi everyone, I'm Kevin J. Kennedy, and this is the first episode of the Horror Show. And today with me, I have Simon Clark. Hi Simon, how you doing?
Hi there, Kevin. Yeah, good to be on the show.
Right, so me and Simon and another author called Gord Rollo have recently worked together on a project for the Dark Tide series, the Crystal Lake Publishing. So, for any of you who haven't followed it, there is normally 3 novellas in each book, and each book is themed. So, we were the 17th book in the series, and we titled our book Creatures of the Night, Vicious Vampire Tales. I hope you can see that, and the light isn't reflecting on it too much. So, we decided that for the first episode, we would have a wee chat, talk about the book, and talk about some other authors. We've recently done an interview together with Gord, who couldn't be here this evening. So if you have seen that, there might be a little bit of repetition, but if you haven't, as I say, we'll tell you a little bit about the book. Simon, do you want to tell us a wee bit about your novella in the book?
Yeah, well, mine's called Return of the Blood Feeders, subtitle From the Blood Red World of Vampiric. It's going back quite a few years. I wrote a novel, wrote a vampire novel when people were telling me, whatever you do, don't write a vampire novel. I'd written a couple of novels now about the Heart Blood Crazy. I'm thinking about writing a new novel, and I thought I'd like to write about vampires, but try and reinvent the vampire and make them make them very nasty, vicious, almost like kind of like land sharks. They're out prowling, attacking people impulsively. So I wrote this novel called Vampiric, set it in Yorkshire in a fictional place called Leppington, which was based on the kind of town I'm familiar with in Yorkshire. These small, remote backwaters where usually nothing happens. With this town, Leppington, I imagine that there's a labyrinth of tunnels run under the town, and these tunnels were occupied by vampires. And like I say, people are saying, "Oh, don't write a vampire novel. It'll be terrible. It'll be a flop. It just won't work." I thought, well, no, I'm going to go ahead and write it. So I thought, I'll do a different take on vampires. Like I said, make them vicious, make them basically the undead Vikings, the dead Viking warriors have been brought back to prey on the living. Book was published and it was a really good success. It was it amazed me. I was believing people when they said, "Oh, it's going to be a terrible failure. Don't write a vampire novel," and I wrote one. That Vampiric really took off and really was successful. And maybe it was about the time when Buffy was hugely popular. So there were plenty of like the romantic teenage vampires.
Yeah.
There were, it wasn't too gruesome, and mine was, full on, full blooded gruesomeness. But I think that really connected with lots of readers. It was published in Britain in hardback, then in paperback, and published in other countries around the world, published in America, and did really well. So I was thoroughly pleased with that. And so, actually, I should cut a long story short. And so when Kevin very kindly asked me to, would I like to write a novella for the Crystal Lake publication, I thought, well, and as we were talking about it, and we decided it was going to be vampires, I thought, well, I'm just going to go back to Leppington, go back to the world created for Vampiric, because it always seems to live on in my head, as if it's a story that's not finished, and the vampire creatures are still calling me, saying, come back, tell our story. So when I got the opportunity to write this vampire novella, I thought, yeah, I'm just going to go back to Leppington. I'm going to bring those vampires back, and also a monstrous creature called Hellsphere, which, if you read the novella, you'll find out about Hellsphere. A loathsome, gigantic creature that lurks under a very unassuming, normal Yorkshire town. So you're going to tell us something about your novella, Kevin?
Yeah, before I do, I was just going to say I'd read Vampiric. I think I said to you, I always thought it was Vampiric, but Vampiric I read it years ago, and I believe that the sequel's Vampiric Rights. And I think, am I right saying there's 3 other linked books? There's Vampiric Bride and
yeah, Whitby Vampiric. Yeah, there's been a couple of spin-offs and a couple of short stories written in that setting. But yeah, it's one of those things that it's one of those stories that pull me back. But yeah, so thank you for asking me. Otherwise, that
You're welcome. For those of you that again didn't see the last interview we done, I've been reading Simon's work for 25 plus years. I discovered him through his novel Blood Crazy, which recently has been it's been re-released through a new publisher, a brand new cover. And after all this time, he has finally written a sequel, and then a sequel to that. So it's now a trilogy, which is brilliant for fans that have read that original book, and that's all they've had for a long, long time. I've recently just finished reading the third book in the series, which is Aten Present. Is that correct?
Aten Present, yeah.
Aten, sorry, I was just saying.
Yeah, I should watch what I do with these titles that a bit hard to pronounce, because it's not just you, Kev. Quite a few people have thought, well, how do I
say in the book? It rhymes with Satan, doesn't it? But I forgot. It's brilliant. So, for anybody that's read Blood Crazy and hasn't read the sequels yet, I highly recommend both sequels. And the third book in the series, I've not actually spoke to Simon if there's ever going to be any more. But the third book in the series for me was a nice wrap up. Some books are a bit too open-ended for my taste, and it leaves you with kind of, well, I need the next book now. I think, I would love more in that world. If Simon writes a fourth book, I'm reading it. But as things stand, it's a nice trilogy.
Oh, thank you. And it's great to hear things like this, that, support from you and from other readers. It encourages me to write more, and certainly with Blood Crazy, I mean, there's been such great feedback on that for a long time I've thought I'd like to write a sequel to Blood Crazy, and it was really the feedback from readers, especially sort of like with the advent of Twitter, now X, and people started getting in touch saying, "Oh, when's there going to be a sequel? When's there going to be an audio version? When's there going to be a film of Blood Crazy?" Yeah. And things are slowly starting to happen, in that direction. So, fingers crossed.
So I suppose, as I said, we haven't spoken about it. I have to ask: is there any intention to write a fourth book in the series? Or are you quite happy where you've left it?
I must admit, I'll be thinking about it. Yeah. No firm plans at the moment, but again, it's one of these stories that says, come back, write more, write more Blood Crazy. So I'll certainly be thinking about it.
Yeah, as I say, I loved it. It was nice to see. I think after so many years pass, when you read a book, even whether you think there'll be a sequel, whether you hope there'll be a sequel, after maybe a decade, I think you kind of think to yourself, well, there's not going to be a sequel. This is where we're leaving that story. So it was quite a surprise, as I say, to find out years later that there was going to be the sequel. And as I found that out, I think I messaged you and you told me it was going to be a trilogy, which meant as I was reading book 2, I had something else to look forward to. So, but for anybody, as I say, want to read them now, you can go and buy books 2 and 3. They're available in all the usual places. So definitely worth a read. As Simon had said, obviously, I'd probably tell you a little bit about my novella and the Creatures of the Night book that we wrote. So we had agreed in Vampires, me, Simon and Gord had a chat. I got the opportunity to work with Crystal Lake, speaking to Joe Mindheart, and to be part of that series. And, straight away, the first 2 authors I went and spoke to was Simon and Gord. So I was really happy that they wanted to come on board, and we decided that Vampires was what we would like to write about. But as Simon kind of touched upon, I think that for a while Vampires were not entirely horror. A lot of people in the horror industry kind of moved away from vampires, or a bit fed up with what was happening. But when people move away from stuff for so long, then you kind of have a lack of it, and it's sometimes interesting to then go and revisit it. So we all felt that we would like to write something fairly brutal. So my story is about a guy that literally just been turned. It is about a couple, but it's very much not a romance story. And they go travelling, and they happen to meet a werewolf couple. And there's a bit of carnage and some action, and then they go their own separate ways. And then basically a body is dumped in their doorstep, and they're told to come to an address. So they phone their werewolf friends and decide to take along some backup because they don't really know what's going on. And without going into too much detail in the story, there's a demon that wants them to work alongside them. But as I say again, very much a horror themed story. It's I've read some stuff like that probably falls into fantasy and things like that, but it's loads of action, loads of killing, loads of brutality. Told the story very much in my voice. I like fast-paced action in my horror stories, so that's really what you get from my story. It's called Perspective. And although Gord couldn't be here this evening, Gord has came at it from another angle again for me and Simon, where he, a lot of people that have so far reviewed the book have been pretty happy that it's set in Canada. That's actually where Gord lives, although he's British. And his is about a town, is it Nova Scotia? I think it might be, is that right? And it's about a mine that's caved in, and then it's filled in with water, and it's a sort of, an abandoned place. And a lot of people drowned as the mine caved in. And that's where the sort of vampire element comes from. So it's very, very different from anything that I've read. I've read a lot of vampire stories. But we will have Gord on at some point when he's available, and he'll tell you a wee bit more about his story in some detail. Simon, I never got a chance to ask you when we previously spoke as well. Have you got some favourite vampire books that grew your love for vampires back in the day, or anything you've read over the recent years that really jumped out at you?
Well, that's I mean, I guess really what I started with was watching the films, the Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing vampire horror films. That was a big influence on me, the Hammer horror, and in fact, just recently I watched the old Universal Bela Lugosi Dracula again, and the DVD comes with the Spanish version as well, the Spanish language version, which I think most people be aware of it, that when they filmed the Bela Lugosi version, they filmed it by day, and then a Spanish film they filmed a Spanish language version by night using different actors, but using the same sets. So it's interesting to see those. So I think that really, ignited my interest years ago watching the movies. Regarding books, I mean, there's things like Richard Lehman's The Stake.
Yeah, good book.
I suppose what I liked particularly was the ones that might not actually seem to be vampire novels, or a little bit ambiguous, like I Am Legend. That's it. I mean, it's like, I don't know, catchy. It caught lightning in a bottle writing that book. I mean, it's such a high energy one, so cleanly written, you just buzz through it so fast.
It's very strange in that it's a classic book now, right, a long time ago, and when you read it, because of the setting, it could be set in the modern day, because everything's kind of, the world's kind of stopped, so there's no tech around or anything to sort of date the story. It was a while ago I read it, but I remember I was really impressed, and I think, as is always the case, the book's generally better than the movie, but the book is a lot better than the movie. It was. I really enjoyed reading that, and it's quite thin too. I think 120, 150 pages or something like that. It's not
a long one. Yeah, you can almost like read it in a couple of hours. It's
yeah,
and so written such an economic way. Such a pared back style. I really do. I think it's one of the standout books. But again, the question is, are the creatures really vampires, or are there something else? But
yeah,
that doesn't really matter. I think it's just such a good book.
No, I think it's definitely vampire-esque. As I say, I think there's some books where there's a bit of you're not too sure. Like yourself, I liked a lot of vampire movies. If you've been really young, I always remember The Lost Boys stuck with me. I seen Lost Boys when I was quite young. I liked Fright Night. Fright Night was a good one when I was younger as well. You mentioned Stake by Richard Lehman. He's got another vampire novel, Bite, as well. But I grabbed a copy just to kind of flash up. One of my favourite vampire books. I don't know if you can see that too well. I'm worried about the light sort of obscuring the cover. Live Girls by Ray Garton.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read it. It's it's mental. It's at a time where the vampires again were sort of probably more hidden in the shadows and things like that. And his vampires are out in the open, sort of working in a strip club, which is fairly common these days. You watch a lot of movies and you see things set like that in the movies, but Live Girls has been about for a while. For anybody that's never read Ray Garton, sadly he passed away. I'm going to say within the last year. It's definitely not much longer than that. But Ray Garton's a fantastic author as well. He's worth checking out his books if you've not read them. He's got another vampire book called Lot Lizards, which is absolute carnage. It's about truck stop sort of prostitutes, which I believe in America are called Lot Lizards. And the vampires in this story. It's very sort of B-movie schlocky, but it's brilliant. So that's another one that's worth checking out if you're looking for some vampire fiction. Outside the new book, obviously.
Because that's it. Yeah, read ours first, and then
need to check that first. Yeah, definitely. It seems to be doing really well. It's only been out for how long's it been out now? Less than 2 weeks.
Yeah, it will be less than 2 weeks. Yeah. It's available in ebook, isn't it, and hardback and paperback.
Ebook, paperback, and hardback. It seems to be doing well in the Amazon charts. The reviews are starting to flow in Goodreads. It seems to be well received. So, fingers crossed, people keep buying it, and reading it. It's always nice to see what people's thoughts are in the book. I've wrote a few really short vampire stories, so it was nice to write something novella length and just play a bit with the vampire mythology. So we sort of said before coming on we were going to have a wee chat about some other authors. Who are some of the authors that get you into horror?
Well, yeah, it's going way back. Probably the first things I was reading were things like the Pan Book of Horror Stories and the sort of library anthologies back then. I used to basically live in the library when I was about 15 or 16, borrowing these books. There was lots of, was it William Kimber, the hardback publisher that was specialising in library editions, and they published a lot of anthologies of not so much horror stories, more ghost ones. But I really got into the Pan Book of Horror Stories. I mean, they were really quite. They were vicious, brutal stories quite often. Edited by Herbert Van Val. It back then I wasn't really interested in knowing who the writers were. Aged about 13 or 14, reading these terrific anthologies with really hard-hitting horror stories. And if it's Pan Book of Horror, you were in for a heck of a ride with these gruesome stories. And I must admit, I never even paid any attention to who was writing them. It was only later, when I was perhaps 14 or 15, a year or two later, that I started picking up on which writers I liked. Some were, quite the old vintage ones. People like Bram Stoker and William Hope Hodgson, Arthur Mack, and then I was getting into James Herbert, Stephen King, and then Clive Barker. Which is. The Clive Barker books of blood, when they came out, I mean, they were just like a nuclear blast. They just blew everything away. They were just so different from what was being written at the time. But I mean, I suppose I got into reading horror at an early age. Sorry, I'm putting my thumb over the camera. Got into reading horror at an early age, and then just accumulated a heck of a lot of books. Like I say, perhaps one of my favourite books of all time is The Shining by Stephen King. I mean, that's just his writing. It's it's almost like a symphony. It's like music. It's not almost like not words. There's something else there that's the words resonate. Just horror all the way through. What about yourself, Kevin? What got
Well,
you into it?
I started reading point horror books, a lot of which were written by Ariel Stein, who I think moved on to Goosebumps, but sort of pre-Goosebumps. And for my memory, I think that the point horror books were aimed at maybe older teens, just a wee bit more probably brutal than Goosebumps. But that was the early for reading wise, and then the first sort of adult horror book I read was called Darkness Tellers by Richard Lehman. And I picked it up specifically because I was in fourth year at high school. I think our third year whole year's March was based in an essay we had to write about a book I hadn't read for a while at that age, 15 maybe. So I grabbed a book with a Ouija board in the front of it because I like stuff like that, and it turned out it was 600 pages, and I'd only read a small book, but I devoured it in two days, maybe 3 days at a push. And it was the best thing I'd ever read. So I just started reading his books, and I read about 40 Richard Lehman books before I touched another author. And I loved everything he'd written. And then, like yourself, I read James Herbert, Sean Hudson, Stephen King, Anne Rice, like everything that you could get in the UK. And it was Borders we had at the time. And they had a lot of horror books, but it was the same authors. It was 50% Stephen King, and then Dean Koontz had a big, massive whack of books, and then, as I see other people, Anne Rice, James Herbert, Sean Hudson, all maybe had 10, 12 books each in the section, and I didn't find any of them had like pacing the way Lehman did, that fast pace that I love, and the action that he had. And people will argue that, you know, other people are better writers than Lehman, but it's down to taste. It's what you want out of a story. And I struggled after I read all Richard Lehman's books to find other authors, and I discovered back in the days before Facebook and things, I discovered the Richard Lehman message board and managed to get recommendations off the fans that were still on there because Richard had passed away, but there was maybe 30 people still frequenting the board, and they listed their favourite books, and there was a kind of theme between authors and certain books that popped out. So it led me to Brian Keane, Edward Lee, Jack Ketchum, and Ray Garton. And through that, I found Leisure Publishing, because a lot of the guys were being published through Leisure at the time, which was how I just started. I'm sure, was Blood Crazy through Leisure?
It was, yeah.
I as I said, I've read quite a few of your books, but I couldn't remember which ones were Leisure. But I think it was King Blood Leisure, or was that?
That was never published by Leisure.
No, I must have read the Leisure Blood Crazy, then found King Blood.
Yeah.
And then, as I said to you, I read Nailed by the Heart and Vampiric and worked through them. But I was a wee bit the opposite for yourself, because I had a certain taste for certain writing styles. I was very much about finding an author I liked and then just reading other books, as opposed to just kind of finding horror books and trying stories. So I tried to kind of solidify the authors that had that fast-paced, mental type of. I think, you know, been speaking about it a lot recently online, like splatterpunk, which a lot of the authors, some of their books fell into. And that was how I kind of got into reading horror through the guys, and then obviously Leisure, I think, had been not paying a lot of their authors, and they went under. And then the indie market they were kind of mid-market, I think, but the indie market, to me, probably flourished a wee bit because Leisure weren't there for people to go to, and a lot of guys that had been with Leisure maybe dabbled a bit in self-publishing or went to small presses. And then I found other authors through presses that I liked, and just kind of, until now I read loads of different people, but very much stick to the indie market. I'm not very much a mass market reader. But that was how it was through Richard Lehman I came about it, and as I say, very much. Although I don't think he wasn't an indie author at all, but I think when I was reading him, he was really big in the UK, and I don't think at that point he was doing that well in America. Was it Headline that published all his books at that point?
In Britain, yeah. I mean, yeah, because it's one of these things. I mean, Richard Lehman, obviously an American writer, but his big success was in in Britain and Australia. And really, have you read his Writer's Tale, his autobiography?
I absolutely loved it. I don't read a lot of how to write books, but because I love Layman, I read A Writer's Tale, and I thought it was fantastic.
Because he really struggled for years and years to get a publisher in America, or a publisher that would take him seriously. If I remember right, there'd be like a publisher would publish one of his books in America, but if it didn't hit a certain target, they just wouldn't publish anymore. So I think he had. Whereas in Britain, I think he was having a book published every year. In America, I think it was every 5 or 6 years. Perhaps one publisher would take him on just for one book and then drop him again. And it was only really when Leisure came along, around about 2000, and started publishing him, that Richard Layman sort of got good exposure in the States, and fortunately lived long enough to see his books taking off, even though they're quite old ones at that time, but taking off in America. That's something which really pleased him. And such a nice guy as well. I mean, I was looking up him a couple of times.
I never got a chance to speak to Richard. As I say, I was 15 when I discovered these books. By the time I found his message board, I think I actually must have been about 19, and I think he was recently passed at that time. As I say, anybody I've ever spoke to speaks very fondly of him. I've seen a few pictures. He looked like quite a happy lad. And as I say, for me, my entire love of horror, most of it, reading horror literature, came from finding him, discovering him, and having to devour 40 plus books. That, as I say, had me solidly involved in reading that genre and finding similar authors probably. So I was taken too soon. It's very, very sad. But he left that. For anybody who hasn't tried Richard Layman or hasn't read through all these books, I strongly suggest, to say, picking them up and reading them. They're a lot of fun. Simon, I know that you don't have a massive amount of time this evening, so I was wondering if you wanted to maybe tell us a wee bit about one of your books. I think we spoke about Blood Crazy, with that being personal favourite. And you now bringing that back to not bringing it back, but now turning it into a trilogy. If you want to have a wee chat about that.
Yeah, we'll do. Blood Crazy came out about mid-90s, first published in Britain. I always thought of it as like a science fiction novel, because basically the idea is that everybody over the age of 19 becomes murderously insane and attacks young people. It's sometimes described as a zombie novel, but I don't think it is a zombie novel. It's adult. Yeah, adults have had some kind of mental rearrangement which turns them into homicidal maniacs. A nice cozy tale to read on a winter's night. But I thought of it as science fiction. But the first novel I sold was Nail by the Heart. That's the artwork for it, for Nail by the Heart, and that was definitely a horror novel. And so the publisher, Hodder and Stoughton, they bought the first 2 books, and so I spoke to the editor and said, "Oh, one's horror and one's science fiction." And he said, "No, Simon, they're both horror. If first one's going to be horror, second one's got to be horror. It's a marketing thing. We can't have the salespeople going out and trying to say, to sell Nail by the Heart as horror, and then 6 months later they say, oh, this is actually the second book, science fiction, Blood Crazy." So it became horror. I'm comfortable with that. I'm happy with that. That's not a problem.
I think for me, I've always seen it as a horror book. I suppose it's different when you're writing it and it's your book, you get your views, but I read it in very much horror, and I'm just thinking, you said the zombie thing, and I know your book was years before it, but when you started to watch things like the fast-paced zombies, like I don't know if you've seen the remake of Dawn of the Dead, but that sort of movie, has similarities to your book. I know your book, as I say, came first. I get the connection to zombies, although they're very much no zombies.
Yeah. Basically, the idea that the adults have become, they're deranged, and something strange is happening inside their head, which drives them to kill young people. So it was, a very brutal book. And when I actually reread it for publication recently. I hadn't read it for, it must have been over 20 years, and I thought, my God, how did they actually write this? How did they get away with these things and that style? I mean, I think it probably goes back to my youth and sort of the punk rock kind of notion of, pick up a guitar even if you don't know how to play it and just thrash the hell out of it and get a sound out of it. And I think back then, I was a new writer, and I thought, well, just sit down and thrash the hell out of the story. Just write it, just get it down onto paper or onto the computer. Very early version of a computer back then. Just write the story. And when I reread it, it was almost kind of, almost like you should have a punk rock theme track, a theme to it.
And it's became a sort of cult classic. I think just literally when you're talking popped into my head that how I found the book. I know that over the years I've heard a lot of my favourite authors mention that they absolutely love Blood Crazy. So most horror authors are inspired by other things I've read. I know where I came across Blood Crazy the first time. I don't know if you've ever been on the Fantastic Fiction pages, which is almost like a bibliography of horror author, well, any author's books. But Richard Lehman's Fantastic Fiction page at the bottom of it recommends 5 books from memory, and one of them was Your Blood Crazy, and another one was Edward Lee's City Inferno, which is also one of my favourite books. So it was actually Lehman that had recommended your book.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, well, yeah,
it's probably still on there. It's worth a look.
I'll have a look. Yeah, but it was certainly one of these books that took on a life of its own, and it without a shadow of a doubt, Blood Crazy has been the most popular book I've written. I mean, I'm pleased with Vampiric. I'm pleased with Night of the Triffids, which have they've sold well and had really good reviews and a good reception. But there's something about Blood Crazy. It's a bit odd that it seems to get under people's skin, but in a good way. I've met people at like book signings, and you can tell it's actually obsessed them a bit. They've become, I won't say strange, but it's like almost like fused with the nervous system. They talk about Blood Crazy in a different way to other books.
The characters are very relatable for the situation that's happening. And when I did read the book, I was round about the age of the people that, I can't remember if I was underage, where I wouldn't have been one of the people that turned crazy.
Right,
I was round about and sort of associated with, well, I wouldn't have been crazy. As opposed to now reading it now as a 43-year-old man, where obviously I would have turned. But it's sort of, there's a lot of carnage in it, but it's not just a carnage book. You've got Nick Ayton, who is a fantastic character, and then you have his relationship with Tug Slater, who is a maniac. And it's not a particularly friendly relationship. It's brilliant. And as I said, very relatable, so that's good. And it's I suppose different because Nailed by the Heart is, I said to you earlier, I absolutely love Nailed by the Heart, but it's certainly a quieter horror.
Yes,
Blood Crazy, and it's quite claustrophobic. You can feel I read it so long ago, but the family sort of pressure that are living at the fort from memory, and brilliant. But very, very, very different for Blood Crazy.
No, yeah, well, certainly with Blood Crazy, again, it's one of these books that's been reprinted a lot. Cemetery Dance did a deluxe hardback edition. It's been published in other countries like Greece and Japan. It was that's it. I mean, it sort of acquired like a cult status. It sounds like being a bit of an egomaniac, me saying that, but like I say, I've been to conventions, and there was one, and a guy turned up. He's in America. A guy turned up and said, "Are you Simon Clarke?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Did you write Blood Crazy?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, I love that book, but I didn't know you were going to be here for. Otherwise, I'd have brought my book with me and had it signed." And he says, "Are you going to be around here for another hour or so?" Yeah. I said, "Sure." Yeah. I said, "I'm going to drive home and get the book and bring it back." He says, I live 50 miles away. So it's a round trip of 100 miles. So will you still be hanging around? And I'll wait here. And so he jumped into his car, drove off. He must have been broken every speed limit possible. And then came running back into the convention room, sweating and saying, I've got the book, and I signed it for him. But you could tell, it's there's something about the book that had really got a hold on him in a good way.
Some books just stick with you, and I've heard a lot of, as I say, I'm relatively new to the sort of writing world, but I've spoke to authors for years and years before I ever considered writing even a short story, simply because I loved reading, and I tended to, back in the days before social media was as big, if I read 3 or 4 books by an author, I would often try and find a website and an email address and send them a wee message just to say, look, I've read a few books, I absolutely love them. At the time, I was always looking for new authors. So often it was to say, who do you like? Because I thought, well, if I like their books and they recommend somebody, I might like them. And I found, in the early days of the internet, authors really nice. And sometimes they would send you, I've never had it because of the way publishing works now, but authors used to send me cover flats. So effectively, they would get the cover of the book before it was okayed, and they'd maybe have 5 or 6 copies and they'd sign it. I used to have them framed up on my walls. This was all before I met my wife. She very much wasn't a fan of horror stuff all over the walls of the living room. So that was a single man sort of thing. But I had loads of stuff. But as I say, I understand why books stick with people. There's still books that I read. There's books that I probably read 25 years ago that I would still call my favourite and recommend to people, where in modern day I probably don't remember all that much of the story. It's more about the feeling you had when you read that book. It stood out for the other 50 books you read that year. There was 2 or 3 favourites that really touched you. And as I said, for a long, long time before I'd ever spoken to yourself, worked with you, done anything horror related myself, Blood Crazy was always a favourite. So it was nice to get to work with you after that.
I'm really pleased that you reached out, as the saying goes, and you got in touch. Because for anybody watching this, if you've got a favourite author, and you can do, if you can send them a message, it means a heck of a lot to them. I think they'll really appreciate it, and I know I do. Get a message and say, "Well, I really love this book that you wrote," and it gives you a lift. Because so many authors, like yourself, you sat there typing away at the computer, and quite a lot of the time you're not actually going out and meeting the readers. So to get a 2-line message, say, "I love this book," you're going to write some more. Like you say, can you recommend other authors? It means a heck of a lot to an author.
It definitely does, and it's something that I've learned over the last few years through speaking to so many authors, and seeing so many authors that I've enjoyed come along who have released a few books and maybe became a bit disheartened by the industry and disappeared, just stopped writing. There's a lot of self-doubt in writing. You might even have had a book that's been really successful, but I've spoke to some people that they struggle to write that second book because the first book's been so well received. You've got the flip side of that where you're putting stuff out and it's not getting enough sales, therefore it's not getting enough reviews. You don't really know if it's any good. There's a lot of self-doubt in writing. And I think that probably carries through multiple levels. So it's definitely great for authors to hear from people that read their work and just let them know that they enjoy it. I think, again, I've probably kept you for a wee bit too long, Simon, but before we go, is there anywhere that you're going to be doing any signings, any conventions, anywhere somebody can come along and meet you and have a chat?
Yeah, I'll be at Edgelit 7th of September in Derby. That's a day event in Derby. So, I think anybody who's in the area or into writing horror and fantasy will be aware of that. And also, I'll be at Fantasy Con in Chester in mid-October, I think 13th, 15th, something like that. Anyway, mid-October in Chester at Fantasy Con. So, again, if you're there, anybody, they just say hello. Because I know when I first went to conventions, you see famous authors and you feel daunted. You think, oh, I best not speak to them. They wouldn't want that. But, the reverse is true. Just somebody coming up and saying hello, and they don't have to praise the author, but just, oh yeah, I like reading horror, and pleased to meet you. And it just mean a lot to writers. Like you say, the writers can become disillusioned with writing, and you never know, reader coming up to an author and saying, "Oh, I really enjoyed your book," bought a copy of it. I mean, on that day, the author might almost have been thinking, "Oh, I'm going to give up writing," and that could make such a big difference to the author that think, well, somebody's come up and said hello, and they take the time out to say that, I'm going to write that next book. The thought of not writing, but I'll go ahead, and it can make a heck of a lot of difference.
I think one of the things as well that I've felt when I've been at conventions previously as a guest, to meet people and buy things, is you go with a certain budget and often you spend over that budget, but there's almost a sense of guilt if you've went with £100 and you've already spent £200, and you see a few authors that are sitting there and you've got no money left at all. You can't buy one of their books. There's almost a guilt to go and talk to somebody or look at their stuff and then no purchase it because you think it looks like I'm not interested. It might be you took some notes, you're going to buy them at the end of the month when you get paid off Amazon or whatever. But as Simon said, just go up and say hello, have a chat. Authors love to hear it if you love their story, their book, whatever they've done. It's reassuring. It helps them write the next story. So if you don't have a lot of money and you're not in the market to purchase some stuff, still go and chat to your favourite authors. If you have some books that you already own, buy them, bring them along if you know they're going to be there. And most people will be more than happy. I've got a stack of books that the next time or the first time I meet Simon, I'll be taking along for him to sign. I'm sure I'll buy something new, but I've got plenty for you to sign already.
If people bring books that they bought 20 years ago, I'm certainly happy to sign them. It means a lot to me, that people have spent the money on them.
And it must be nice, as I say, when you've been in the industry for a while, to see old versions, old covers, publishers that you've not worked with in years, but that might have been a limited run and somebody's got a copy of that book. It must be nice to see some of the stuff that you've not seen for a while.
Oh, definitely, yeah, and to see, it's good to see a book like a paperback that's all got crumpled covers, and it shows it's somebody's loved that book and read it over and over. And so, I like to see a book with crumpled covers and, that looks as it's being read over and over. That means a lot. The book could tell its own story then, beyond what's in the pages. It's being loved and read over and over. Oops, dropping the Kindle here.
Hello, Simon.
Sort of about. I lost you, Kev.
I can still see you. It looks like it's frozen your end, though. I don't know if you can hear me.
I've actually knocked the not the website off, but if you can still see me.
It's just a frozen picture, but I think, as I say, I know that you were sort of some time constraints, so I think we'll probably wrap that up. That's the first edition of the Horror Show. Thanks very much to Simon Clark for coming on and talking about his books. There will be other episodes. We'll hopefully get Gord Rollo on soon to talk a little bit about his novella and our new book, Creatures of the Night. So I'll flash that up one more time for anybody who would like to check it out. It's the 17th book in the Dark Tide series, Creatures of the Night, Vicious Vampire Tales by Kevin J. Kennedy, Gord Rollo and Simon Clark. Thanks for watching.